Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you've already found something today that has inspired and informed your work. There is so much more. For now, and now for our second main stage of Upswell 2022, and a session I know many of you have really been looking forward to. Ahead, we have an incredible discussion about mirror work. If you're new to the sector or you've been at it for decades, you are finding out, or you already knew, that racial justice work has to start with self reflection. We have two incredible experts in this space here today. Joining us are Dr. Sean Jenwright, founder and CEO of Flourish Agenda, Inc., and author of The Four Pivots Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves, and Raquel Willis, a Black transgender activist, award winning writer, and media strategist. I'm now going to pass it over to the capable hands of Julie Gerke, Vice President of Philanthropy at Walmart, who will moderate this discussion. All right, Julie, take it over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hall-Russell. I couldn't agree more. I am really looking forward to this conversation. First, I want to thank all of you who are joining us. The mirror work isn't easy, and I know you all have been thinking about your work in equity all day, but showing up and really thinking about your leadership and some of the hard internal work and joining this conversation is, I believe, incredibly important. And I am really excited to learn from our guests today, Raquel and Dr. Jenwright. I shared with them just how amazing it has been to research and prepare for this by listening to their words. And I'm just excited about what we're going to learn in this conversation. In the spirit of this, I wanted to just quickly share how I come to this work. As part of Walmart.org, we're working on this both to drive equity. We have equity embedded in all of our work. And a couple of years ago, founded the Center for Racial Equity, which is a $100 million 5-year commitment to bring our business and our philanthropy together to address systemic racism across health, education, criminal justice, and finance systems. But we pair that work with really some work on belonging and thinking about how we work in communities to make them caring and connected, where all people feel like they're a part. I think one of my biggest takeaways in this work has been just how much internal work there is to be done in order to authentically be in this space. And so I am thrilled to learn from Raquel and Dr. Jenwright, who are here and really have been doing this leadership in an authentic way and teaching us all on that journey. So welcome to you both. I thought I start all my interviews with candidates and various things, even after reviewing resumes and bios and all of these things. There's a texture and a meaning to people's story that they don't capture. And so I'd love to start this conversation. And Raquel, if you don't mind starting, tell us a little bit about your story and what brings you to this work.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Julie, Dr. Jenwright, and everyone who is making Upswell so amazing today. So as you introduced me, I am a Black trans woman, but so much more a part of my story, I think, is being someone from the South, being from Augusta, Georgia, growing up in a really kind of traditional Southern family, but also having kind of these layers of a Catholic upbringing on there as well. And so for me to kind of make it out of there as a queer and trans person is interesting, definitely an interesting story. But I think a part of that piece has been that I didn't ever really make it out of my Southernness, right? I had to kind of grow into understanding the importance of it, how it has made me as a person just richer, and bringing all of the people who have made my life and what people consider to be success possible along with me, and allowing them the space to evolve as well. So that has brought me into the activism space. My background in journalism has brought me into seeing stories as organizing tools and also as superpowers. And yeah, so that's just a brief. I know we're going to jump more into it, but I'm glad to be here.
No, I appreciate that. And thank you for sharing it. I think it gives us all more texture to the narrative. Mm-hmm. Dr. Jen Wright, welcome. I'd love to hear a little more about your story and what brings you to this work.
Yeah, I mean, I'll divide it, I guess, into 3 areas of my life. The first, I guess, is my childhood. You know, my mom and daddy from the South. Raquel, I don't know where in the South. My mom and daddy from Jacksonville, Florida, and very much grew up working class in Florida, and then we moved to California, where my father worked in a factory. And I grew up at a time when, you know, your mama would call you and say, come home when the street lights come on. And we would play in the streets. And I had a very, you know, just working class background. And some of the friends that I grew up with are still some of my friends. I think the second thing I'd like to share, just in terms of who I am, is, you know, when I went to college, it was at a time when we would wear those black medallion X. It was, you know, when Spike Lee had come out, right? And it was about a Black awakening, and just learning about who I am as an African-American person. And then thirdly, just my work here in the San Francisco Bay Area with youth. I've seen significant suffering on the part of young people at the hands of institutions. And I have also seen people who are in the movement fighting for justice not take care of themselves and not have the permission or the pathway to see another way of engaging in justice. So I think those 3 things together kind of are the elixir of my who I am.
Thank you for that. And I think it allows us to see a little more while you do this work. So I appreciate you sharing. I'd love to stay with you. Your book is everywhere. I love it. I am here, you know, you're on Brene Brown's podcast. I'm seeing, you know, organizers and activists that I respect recommending the 4 pivots. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the 4 pivots are and how we should be thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, the 4 pivots are really born out of my own work with, on one hand, trying to create just communities and fairness for young people of color, primarily. On the other hand, feeling that I don't have the permission or tools to do it in a way that sustains me. And my own work, in particularly the 4 pivots, is kind of responding to this notion that that to do this work well, we have to be martyrs. And that in my own experience, Julie, that we actually celebrated the martyr culture. And I've lost a few dear friends in this movement because of it. And so the 4 pivots are really born out of really trying to provide a moral and ethical pathway and a profound permission, Julie, to do justice work in ways that is deeper, more sustainable, and more transformative. The 4 pivots are really come out of my mistakes. To be honest with you, y'all read the book. I'm trying to be honest as possible. But this notion of lens to mirror, right? Let me back up a little bit. And the first, I call them a pivot because a change is hard, right? A change requires you gotta go to a class and you gotta learn something and you gotta do something differently. It takes a lot of effort. A pivot is subtle. That means if you do this subtle change over time, you have a profound impact. And so the first pivot is a pivot from lens to mirror, which my own training was, I learned to have an outward look and an analysis of all the problems that I was trying to address with young people in schools, in justice. But I never was given a mirror, which is the deeper reflection about my own insecurities, about stuff I need to heal from my own childhood, stuff I was bringing into the movement, y'all, right? And Julie, if I talk too much, you got to cut me off because
you're good. This is going to ground us all in the work.
About the own wounds that I was bringing into the movement work that I was not aware of. and I wasn't given the tool. The mirror work, which is harder work than lens work, which is about what do I need to heal from? What are my own insecurities? What am I running from? What are my own fears and insecurities? What are my own dreams? And so that first pivot is practicing deeper self-reflection about who we are and who we aim to become. The second pivot is a pivot in our relationships from transactional to transformative. And in the book, I try to give examples of transactional relationships are these sort of ways that we relate to one another that are so external, that are perfunctory, right? Like, I just know you, you're a funder, you give me some money to build my organization. But the transformative relationships are the relationships where our pieces of our humanity kind of spill out on each other, right? Where we see each other as human beings. And those spaces in our movement work, sometimes they exist, but how do we make them more intentional, right? How do we actually create intentional organizations, intentional movements where we give each other permission to be human with one another, right? Talk about our fears. The third pivot is a pivot from problem to possibility. In our book, I talk about this concept that Trista Harris calls problem loving. And this is this notion that what oppression has done to us and marginalization has created a culture and a way that we think, that it suggests to us and tells us actually that we don't have the permission to dream beyond it. That all we can do is try to reduce the misery, violence reduction, right? And it's enshrined in our language. Even the term, and I'm not suggesting we should not do this, but even the term anti-racist, right? Which is important work, but we are defining what we want by the absence of what we don't, as opposed to defining what we really want. We want communities of belonging. We want inclusion, right? Anti-racism is an important, critical feature and factor in reaching belonging and inclusion. So the pivot from problem to possibility pushes us to think about, what is it we dream about? What are we actually trying to accomplish? Who do I have to become to create the transformation in the world that we want to see? And then lastly, this notion of a pivot from hustle to flow. And this sort of digestion, we sort of digest doses of capitalist culture that tells us we always have to be in frenzy, y'all, right? This constant addiction to frenzy we have in our organizations, we have in our culture, believe that we always need to be busy with something. And that it allows us it prevents us from being present with each other, being present in the work that we do. And so the last pivot is a pivot from hustle to flow. And flow just simply suggests that we have a conscious effort, that we find times for slowing down, we create spaces in our organizations for slowing down, and that we make commitments to ourselves and our relationships that flow and time is important. The last thing I'll say about flow is in the book, I talk about a form of inequality that's rarely grappled with in our movements, and that is rest inequality. And as people of color, and society and capitalist culture and white supremacist culture who primarily sees brown and black bodies as forms of work and labor, that our ability to engage in rest and recreation is an important and critical feature in our own freedom and liberation. And so we create structures in our organizations, and to have a conscious awareness that our rest and restoration and recreation is an important feature in our movements for justice.
Thank you for that. First, impressive that you're able to summarize a book that quickly. So thank you. But also thank you for the work. It really resonates with me, and I know with a lot of others. Raquel, we were talking, you're in the middle of writing a memoir. That is a lot of mirror work, and a lot of, and you're really being a transformative leader. And I think doing it in a hopefully sustainable way. Can you talk about your response to thinking about these 4 pivots and how they resonate with you?
Well, that's a big hope, Julie, with the sustainability piece. It's definitely work. I just to back up a second. So my mom is from Jacksonville, Florida. She was born and
Oh,
raised in Jacksonville, Florida. So we do have that connection. And I grew up going there during the summers, going out to Fernandina Beach and all of that. So yeah, so Jacksonville is definitely in my history as well. Um and I so much resonates with the four pivots theory and praxis. I what has kind of jumped out at me in this summation really is I think this idea that if you are involved in social justice work or activism work or trying to change the world, that you have to constantly be this like vessel for other people's liberation, right? So this idea that as the leader, you are the bridge. And that's not actually, to take the word sustainable, that's not actually a sustainable way of moving. It's not actually in line with kind of a collective ideal. It is still kind of within this um individualistic capitalist framework, right? Where you are the fulcrum by which everyone else can shift and change. And that's not real. So much of the four pivots speaks to me, especially when I think about relationships, I've had throughout my life, and all types of relationships. And I think about the ways that when we have had a culture that's so focused on the exterior, especially as a Black trans woman, so much of my relationships has been conditional on how I have presented at one time or another, how I have looked, how I have showed up just physically in a space. And I think in some ways all of these isms and systems of oppression have shredded up opportunities for true kind of genuine connection, because people are like, oh, I don't understand you, so I can't connect with you. I can't connect with your humanity. And I love the possibility of the four pivots and kind of thinking about the ways that we can kind of pull out some of those ideas to kind of strip away some of the baggage that I think society places on people on the margins as we kind of move through the world. I do think there are a lot of ways that we are kind of torn apart from each other. And I think the other thing, I have so many notes just for the book, but the other thing as well is thinking about vulnerability. I really appreciate the segments on vulnerability, Doctor. And I think about just the potential of vulnerability. So I grew up and I love the piece where you talk about the difficulty for Black men to be vulnerable, because and I think about this a lot, right? Obviously I moved through the world as a woman, but I was raised in a household where I was seen as a boy, right? And kind of had all of these expectations around masculinity. And I think about the way that we kind of, even across genders, don't speak to the power of vulnerability enough in our society.
that's right.
It's seen as a weakness.
That's
I mean,
right.
even for Black women,
Right.
Black cis women throughout life, right? The idea of being any kind of open or receptive or soft, these are concepts that have not been accessible to Black people across gender spectrums. And it's taken a lot of work. And I still have to do the work to remember, oh, it's not a weakness to tell someone that I feel a way about how they approached me, or feel a way about how a conversation went, or feel a way about a decision that was made in a company that didn't actually speak to my life, right? Or didn't actually consider that I was still a human, even beyond the roles that I have to fulfill in this job description. So I really resonate. The vulnerability piece really resonated with me, because I think there's so much power in transforming our relationship around how we think about it.
I'm over here snapping.
I love the powerful stories attached to this. You
Yeah.
both are articulating, and Dr. Jenright, in your articulation, there's a conflation I sometimes hear of, or actually a potential in what I hear from you, false dichotomy between belonging and equity. And in many ways, I hear you articulating equity as a path to belonging. Can you both help us unpack this? You're using both words. You're really thinking about this. You're also talking about the self. We've got to start with, where do we start in this? And how do we think about these two concepts that sometimes are positioned as separate from each other?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, I'm going to start with something that happened to me last week as a way to answer that question. We were having a healing retreat here in California, up in the mountains near Santa Cruz, and it was a group of providers that work in violence prevention around the state who just they needed to be cared for. They needed healing because they're out on the front lines. And in our last session, we were all going around and just talking about what we learned. And these were formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters. These were, mostly of color. And they were coming from their hearts, like we were really telling. And the last person that was the only white person in the room, he was the very last person. Like, so we were finally at the last person. Okay, so he was the white person and the only white person in the room that presented, relatively kind of professional, like he'd been in in this work. And he started talking about how he was a lawyer and an attorney and he was defending folks of color. And I was like, oh, here we go again. I was making assumptions. And then he said, about a year ago, I had to go to the hospital because something was wrong. As they were putting IVs in me, I was still on the phone handling business. And then they found something what they thought was wrong with me wasn't what was wrong. And then they came and said they diagnosed me with cancer. And so this whole year I've been going through chemotherapy. And there's something when he shared that it shifted me. I had labeled him with assumptions about why you're here. You don't belong. You're not on the front lines like these young people, these folks of color. You haven't been formally incarcerated. Why are you? This is me, y'all. This is the me, right? When he said that, it shifted me. You do belong here, right? Because you need to heal. And so part of what the book is trying to do is really push us to think about belonging in a more courageous way. And that is, how do we actually find belonging for those that we are most not like? That's the work. So at this retreat, I had become seduced with creating belonging with folks of color and folks that are doing work that I'm familiar with. But I had not seen him as a person that belongs in that circle until he shared a piece of his humanity with us. And everyone in that circle saturated him with belonging. Y'all feel me? And so part of what I'm trying to get in the book is, how do we actually create a sense of belonging with those that even that we disagree with, that we see not as a part of our tribe? And that's harder work. That's the hard work that I hope people at least begin to wrestle with and grapple with.
That's really powerful. And I can speak personally, difficult. Raquel, are there things you'd want to add, or kind of stories that influence you as you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, what has been helpful for me has kind of taking from obviously the theories and discussions around the gender binary, but kind of applying them to how we think about privilege and oppression. I don't believe that there's a binary of a privileged experience or an oppressed experience, that we all kind of inhabit all of those to varying degrees, depending on context, depending on the environment, depending on who we're in relationship with, what spaces we're in. So in one of the stories that really made that clear for me was, for me as a Black trans woman, I went to college and had this journalism degree and have been able to have consistent employment and came from this middle class background. And so I had a ton of privilege, but it really wasn't until I was in spaces organizing with other Black trans women in Atlanta, Georgia, for instance, that was kind of a mirror up for me to kind of understand, oh, there's so many ways that I wasn't understanding the breadth of experience, even amongst the group that I'm a part of. And so I was working with someone who is a dear friend now, Toni Michelle Williams. She's the executive director of an organization called Solutions Not Punishments, collaborative down in Atlanta, Georgia. And at the time, she was the internship leader and I was an intern. And we were doing work with people being profiled as sex workers by local police. And so we went and were out in community with a number of Black trans women. And that experience touched me so much because it was kind of my first kind of real like on the street experience with other girls, you know, as we say. And when we got back in the car after kind of doing some survey work to kind of collect data for this report we were drafting, I was just like bawling in the car. I mean, it was like, serving soap opera tears. And I was saying, we've got to get them off the street. There are other options. They don't have to be doing this. And, in a very kind of sobering way, Toni Michelle was like, what you're feeling is valid. And also you're nobody's savior. So in all of this kind of gentle reprimanding, she was reminding me that even I, as a fellow Black trans woman, had picked up some of these saviorism ideas, right? Again, kind of going back to this idea that, oh, I'm the vessel, I'm the fulcrum by which everyone else can get liberated in my community. That really helped me think about that kind of idea that, oh, yeah, I'm a Black trans woman, but also there's so many different degrees of privilege that allow me to show up and think the way that I was at that time.
You can see me taking like pretty copious notes on the side so that I don't lose this wisdom you're both sharing. Both of you are talking about work, we're talking with a group of leaders and communities across the country who are doing this hard work in community. But you're both talking about work that starts individually. If you're giving advice to these people in community about the role individual healing plays and individual kind of mirror work, where do you start? What's your advice to them?
Raquel, you want to take that or you want me to jump in?
Go for it.
I kind of purposely didn't address it so that either of you could jump in and start.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the first thing is that these pivots, they're not to be, they work together, they're braided together. That is, in order to have transformative relationships, you need mirror work. In order to actually engage in possibility thinking, you need flow, right? That these things are braided together, right? And the part of what I'm suggesting in the book is that when we engage, when we start with ourselves, right? The deeper, harder reflection work with ourselves, that becomes contagious to others, so that we can then begin to create spaces where this kind of transformation is possible. But to start with, like, oh, we're just going to have an organization or a space that is focused on mirror work, but I don't trust nobody there, right? Because we don't have transformative relationships. Or we're gonna engage in flow work, but we have no space for our own reflection. These things, can't happen in silos. And so part of what I'm suggesting is that the work about asking ourselves this question. In the book, I talk about Pastor Ben McBride uses this term: the wrong first question is, what do I need to do? The right first question is, who do I need to become? And Raquel, I think your mentor who said, "Hey, you're not the savior." That was a good moment of like, who do I need to become, and actually, in order to actually hold this space. But these are the kind of questions that allow us to be the individuals and the communities that can actually birth the world that's calling for us, right? And that we may not be able to achieve that world in our current versions of ourselves, but through these pivots, building those relationships, building deep mirror work, that we begin to create the possibility for building communities that are deeper and for transformative change. I hope I answered your question.
Good. Raquel, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much about how we talk about purpose a lot, right? That especially if you've been in corporate world or the professional world, there's like purpose this. And I think on a personal level, understanding your motivations for doing any work is important, and understanding that those motivations can shift, or they will consistently need to be excavated, so you make sure that you're truly being accountable to what you profess to believe is key. I think about some of my experiences in the movement for Black Lives. So back in like 2015, there was such an inflection point around Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. And there was a convening, kind of the first one in Cleveland, Ohio, back in the summer of 2015. And it was the first time so many of us in this kind of national movement, really international movement, had come together. And so, we were kind of teasing out what the contours of the movement were. Now, I don't think everyone understood that fully, but that was what was happening. And there were so many other Black, queer and trans people there. And there were some moments within that convening where it became clear, the movement may not be ready for us, or that it's at least how it felt, because for a lot of people it's their first time meeting Black, queer, and trans folks. And so that was kind of a part of that collective experience for our segment of the movement. And as I reflect on it now, being a little bit, more mature and older, I think about the ways that we're often in spaces where maybe we haven't interrogated why we're there, right? What we're seeking. If we say we're seeking collective liberation, yes, that's a thing. But on a personal level, what are you looking for? I'll speak for myself. I didn't realize at the time, but validation to, and that can be a part of belonging, to be seen, to be recognized as existing, as worthy, valuable. I think we often come to places looking for those things, but we haven't figured that out. And all of our journeys to trying to find those things are different. It depends on your parents and your family, your origins. It depends on the experiences all along the way. And then, of course, it's impacted by how our personal experiences brush up against each other, right? To kind of hopefully come together around some banner of collective liberation. So I think that piece, right, kind of stripping down what we mean when we talk about purpose, what we mean when we talk about our motivations for doing whatever work it is that you're doing. It's important for us to continue to ask those questions.
It's really powerful to think about all of us who are working to make sure others belong and how much we need belonging ourselves. And sometimes don't name that and acknowledge that as a driving motivator as well. It's really powerful, Raquel. I'd love to stay with you. The work you're doing on the Logo Network to tell stories of trans youth, you're talking about trans joy, which I just love, and to steal from a pivot feels like all about possibility creating. Could you talk about that and really what's behind it and the work you're doing there?
Yeah. Well, I worked on the Trans Youth Town Hall with Logo earlier this year. And the point was really to kind of put the spotlight on young trans people. You know, we hear so much about the ongoing legislative fights to restrict the rights of trans youth, whether it be from being their full selves at school or participating in athletics or whatever their passions are, or even something that feels so much so much of a given, which is accessing the healthcare that they need, that even their guardians, are, approving of and affirming of. And so to give them that platform to kind of share their piece. I think we forget the power of youth. We forget that the majority of our social movements, or at least many of them, at least in US history, have come from young people, right? It's come from young people like those at Parkland, right? It's come from young people during the 60s, from civil rights movements to anti-war protests and on and on. And even when I think about a lot of the people in the LGBTQ community that we lionize as these heroes, so many of them were so young during the Stonewall era, or even during the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s. So it felt important to do that work and hear their insights. And that's what I'm invested in. I'm invested in elevating the dignity and honor of trans people, to give us the microphone and the platform to speak for ourselves, in hopes that will then build opportunities for us to work with folks who may not be trans, right? But who are starting to understand that their liberation is bound up in ours. Because we're all trying to fight all of these expectations and restrictions that kind of keep us from being our fullest selves.
Yeah, it's really powerful. So I could talk to you both all day and ask my own questions. I do want to share with the audience, if you have questions for our guests, please put them in the chat. We'll make sure to ask them alongside the long list I have. But as we think about this kind of individual work around joy and belonging and healing, many of us are trying to also pair that with systems level work. Can you talk about how these interconnect? And really, for those of us that are thinking about how do we change our community, how do we change the system, what is the tangible role that this individual work plays in that work? And Dr. Jenwright, do you want to start?
Yeah, there was a colleague of mine. His name is, he did work in Washington, D.C. The juvenile probation system had a phrase that said, we need more love in public policy. And began to build systems, right, that were built on transformative, caring relationships with young people who were incarcerated. But what does it take to do that, right? And I think what it takes is it really takes the commitment of individuals first recognizing the harmfulness in the systems that we have. The systems that we have were built by human beings. They can be reimagined and rebuilt. And I think part of us as leaders take the systems and the policies, the practices, the values for granted, as if we could just tinker with them. And so I think one is like, how do we begin to just really sit with and reimagine public policy in ways that can have a transformative impact? The second is, I think, how are we, what are the practices that we're doing individually and collectively in our system? So, for example, I was just on a talk with youth development workers around the country. What are the systems of support to foster and cultivate your well-being in this system? So that it's not just like you have to take a sick day, right? In other words, you have to be wounded in order to rest, right? So how do we actually build policies and practices that facilitate well-being And that is not sort of assuming that you have to be broken to actually regain well-being so you can work. These are ways that we're really pushing against this idea that human beings are simply cogs in a machine to produce the outcomes that we want. And then thirdly, I think it's important to talk and spend time in community, right? We know that those that are closest to the issues are the most likely to transform it. And so the closer and the proximity that we have with both the pain, but also the possibility of listening to young people, listening to communities who are suffering, and not believing that we have the answer, without deep engagement into the people who are navigating and trying to address these issues. And I think the sort of combination or the elixir of all of these three things give us some way of actually re-engaging and sort of changing our systems in ways that really can respond to healing.
It's such an important reminder that our systems aren't this separate thing, but are truly built by individuals, and how we show up as we work in those systems matters.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I can tell you so many times where I've been asked to come into a city government or parks and recs or even foundations and do an inventory of our policies so that we can achieve equity or we can achieve belonging. And the place that I start with, and we cannot change it with policy alone. Like, we have to actually begin to work with people in those systems, because you can change the policy and the practice, but the people are the same, right? And so you have to create the space, the resources, and the capacity for people to have different conversations, for people to change some of their daily practices that over time facilitates a culture where the policy that you imagine can actually have meaning.
Raquel, you're working with trans youth. You're thinking about this both at their individual experience level, but my sense is trying to string that into a system that's more inclusive and creates belonging. Can you talk about how you're seeing those two things connect?
Absolutely. I mean, right now, it's so interesting. I think I've become even more aware of the fact that even as an individual person, I am a system, right? I'm a collection of not just memories and experiences, but my health on an individual level matters, because if I'm not showing up as someone, definitely not someone healed, right? Because that's not really a destination. It's all about the journey, but someone who is on that journey, right? Who is open to being wrong, open to not understanding everything, then hopefully that will free up the other people that I'm working with, right? The young people that, somewhere along the way I started inspiring. And that's what I want to encourage, especially thinking about the trans community as a whole. I'm sure people are aware, whether they're trans or not, right? We're in this era that's considered the visibility era, or maybe the end of it. I don't know, because we're also facing this backlash as well. And, there's something so glamorized about visibility, glamorized about being seen. But also in our culture, there's a way that we're expected to present this kind of polished exterior, right? So that we can be accepted, so that we can assimilate. And my hope is that the next trans people that come up don't have to check off as many boxes as I felt like I did, or I feel like I do, right? That we can be messy and complicated individuals, and not have all the answers, but still be respected in our humanity and dignity. And that's what I hope, the work that I do, the work that I leave behind will do for the next generations coming up, and also my peers, right? Because our work is inherently collaborative, because what I do impacts, for instance, Toni Michelle, my sister, right? That I was talking about earlier, my mentor, sister, friend, everything, right? All of that work as well has impacted me. So yeah, I mean, the systemic piece, I think, comes from understanding the capacity for evolution on the individual level.
Mm.
I'd love to stay with you. Before we start talking with the group, you were sharing that you spent the weekend visiting with a movement elder. And, we're thinking about transformative leadership and what it takes. Can you share a little bit about what you look to the elders for, and what in those leaders you're really trying to emulate and learn from?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about particularly Black trans elders, I mean, I've had the honor of interviewing Miss Major, so this is who I visited this weekend. And believe it or not, Toni Michelle was there too, so she's come up a lot. And it's really just wild to think that I really was an adult before I knew the history, the breadth of like trans experience, the fact that we've always been here. It took me 21 something years to even know that. But to think that people were paving a way who didn't even know they were paving a way, right? Who were just being themselves, like that is what Miss Major does and has done, right? And now she is 89 years old, and she has people who she's not biologically related to who come visit her. She also has biological children and a partner, and she has this kind of wholeness of her life. And that comes from consistently being vulnerable, consistently being authentic. Even in the times when decades ago, that was impossible or felt impossible. She did that. And so, I urge people to think, what are the things that you think are impossible to do on an individual level, right? And try and do them and see how that spills over, hopefully, into something more collective.
Thank you for that. Dr. Jenried, I've heard you talk about how sometimes our movements are frankly waylaid by leaders who haven't embraced this wholeness and authenticity in their own leadership. Can you talk about how we hold each other accountable to that? How do we build a movement of leaders that are, embracing the 4 pivots and leading what I think will be much more long-term, effective, transformative change?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, at least from my own training, we hide behind our work. We hide behind the rightness of our work, but we're still broken. And we bring that brokenness into our organizations and in our movements without the space for the reconciliation, the restoration, and the healing. And we do it sometimes we're not aware of it. And I've seen it over and over again with organizations and entire good organizations doing good work implode because of the woundedness that we're bringing. It's heartbreaking, Julie. It's heartbreaking. And my goal and my vision is that we actually give ourselves a pathway and permission for that type of healing. So, I mean, I think most importantly, let me make sure I understand your questions because I'm just rambling right now.
You're good.
Your question was about what we need in our movements.
Yeah, and how, as leaders of movements, do we hold each other accountable
to
our own journey of wholeness and healing?
Yeah, so I think we're really good as those of us who are engaged in improving the society and justice. We're really good at accountability. We're good at calling out injustice, which is important and necessary and critical. We're good at holding other folks accountable and sometimes even hold ourselves accountable. I don't think we're good enough at grace. So what we need, I think, as transformative leaders is to have ongoing, deep conversations and examples of how we dance between accountability and grace. and it's okay, right? Like when are we accountable with ourselves, and when do we give ourselves grace? When are we accountable to our communities, and when do we give them grace for when they don't, I work with young people, right? That don't show up in ways that are useful for our work. So how do we hold systems that really want to do well, like a school district or even a juvenile probation department, right? That the people in there really want to, we hope we can hold them accountable, but how do we give them grace? Because the people in there really, really want to change the system. And so I just think that we have to, as leaders, have a dance conversation and not an accountability conversation, and not just a grace conversation, but how do we have the conversation about how we navigate both of those? And when we can hold movements, people, systems accountable, but also what does it mean to actually give systems, people, communities accountability, also grace? And I don't think we have enough of those conversations, but it is in the absence of that accountability and grace that accountability just becomes, it becomes sort of a hammer, right? It becomes, and we don't have the spaciousness to offer any other potential possibilities. But grace allows other possibilities. But we have to balance those. We have to figure out how to balance those in our own leadership. And it ain't easy because, I know it's not easy, but who said it was?
That's really powerful. It gave me chills to think about how I love this idea of the dance between accountability and grace. Raquel, I see that in how you show up with people, even just watching, remotely and videos as I prepared. Can you talk about, do you actively think about that? And when you're showing up in which ways and how you're creating the space for people to learn and evolve, but when you're saying like enough?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think I didn't realize I had that ability, I think, to inspire folks to be more vulnerable or authentic, just like as a person. I think growing up, one of my first experiences, of course, was coming out in high school, right? At that time, I thought I was gay. That was the only language I had. But part of that coming out was understanding that there had to be other people who were kind of suffering in silence too. And the accountability piece, the vulnerability piece, felt so much like an action. It was something you did. And that has stuck with me, but I think it's also, not always in the grand displays, right? It is literally in, are you actively listening to this person that you're in conversation with, right? Are you allowing them to kind of have this full emotional experience in the retelling of their story without interrupting it with your own stuff, right? Which is hard to do, right? It's hard to be some version of selfless even in those little moments, right? But that is work that you can do to then hopefully become something bigger later on, or be prepared for the bigger experience later on. I was going to say the bigger fight, but I know that the good doctor is going to get on me about using certain words and not reframing them. But yes, I think that is a thing, but it does take work. It is draining. After this call, right? Like I'm gonna have to take some downtime, right? I might have to play a little PS5 for like 30 minutes to kind of cool down, because
the pivot to flow.
Yes, because it is work. And I think that we often don't acknowledge that our culture and our society has made it work to show up authentically and vulnerably.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes remaining. I have 2 questions. So I'm going to start with one that I think is really important right now and came in from our audience, which is, how do you extend grace to those that disagree with us? We're in a pretty toxic time where we often write off and search for purity and those kinds of things. What are simple practices, or they may not be simple? How do we extend this grace to people that we really struggle with?
I need more than 5 minutes. It's a great question. Let me see if I can answer it really quickly. Well, in the book, I tried to demonstrate that, which was one of the hardest chapters to write. And I interviewed a white nationalist, self-proclaimed white nationalist that I happened to go to high school with. And in that, I tried to elevate the dialogue, because there's these two ways that we see the world, right? I'm right or you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as we stay there, we stay locked into a worldview that doesn't evolve us as a human species. We just stay, I'm right and you're wrong. What I encourage in this chapter is that how do we actually create the practice, the awareness to observe, to be above it, to observe my rightness and your wrongness, that we can see, we could literally observe the barriers to our evolution as human beings. And just by taking the position that I'm right, you're wrong, and that we could observe it, gives us the perspective to at least begin to hear in a different way. I don't have to agree with you, right? And I don't have to even I don't have to believe anything you believe, but how do we at least practice the space for just listening? So here's what I want to end with, which is, if we don't see each other as human beings, then ultimately your wrongness can devolve into you're less than human, y'all. And in that chapter that I wrote, I disagree with everything he said, right? Everything, except the fact that he loved his child that almost died. I didn't disagree with that. And the fact that I could see him as a human being doesn't mean that I can agree with him, but it means that I could hear you speak as a human being that loves your child the same way I love mine. And if we can just create just enough space for that, just a little bit of space, just to crack it open a bit, there might be some possibility for us to actually see each other in different ways. And I just believe that as where we are as a nation, that the absence of any space of being able to do that is actually eroding our capacity to live and engage in a full, vibrant democracy. And our ability to do that, to open those spaces, opens up the possibility for us to actually create the democracy that our ancestors and that we always believed in. So, a lot more to say on that.
It's powerful. Raquel, any final word before we throw it to kind of our closing?
Yes, I mean, just hearing that last response, I think to kind of what my thoughts are more succinctly is just that, there's more possibility in understanding that you don't know everything than thinking that you do know everything, because that stops the conversation, right? That stops the opportunity, because what is the point of the conversation if you think you know it all? And so I think about that, that there's always more to other people's journey, experiences, and stories, even the people that we cast as villains. And we have to figure out how we can still move forward, even knowing that there is more to their story and we don't know everything. So
thank you all. I feel like you both have shared a lot of wisdom with us today. You've helped us reflect on our shared humanity, but also for the work you do each day to inspire us to show up to be authentic, transformative leaders. So I'm grateful to learn from you both, and thrilled to throw it back to Dr. Hall Russell, who's going to introduce our performance. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Man, the gems that were dropped on that stage, defining what we want by sharing our dreams. We are human systems, layered and complex. No answers without deep engagement. Thanks you so much, Sean and Raquel and Julie, for such an amazing interview. We are going to wrap up this portion with a spoken word performance that I am really excited about. For those of you who are not familiar with spoken word, it's an art form that connects people through sharing stories, emotions, and through lived experiences. I'd like to introduce Marshall Jones, the founder of Mind Body Speak, a leading authority in vocal communication for high stakes discussions. Welcome, Marshall.
Hey, now, how are you? Can you hear me? Hopefully you can hear me. Hello, hello, hello. Uh-oh. Can we hear you? Uh-oh. Here it is. Here it is. It's a technical difficulty. Hold on. Hold on. 1, 2, 3. I think something's being signed. Things are said. Let's just double check. Hello, hello. Okay. I guess. Oh, guess what, everybody? I'm expecting people to like respond to me like there's somebody else there besides me on stage right now, and that's not what's happening. It's all good. Good afternoon. I'm gonna start doing a poem now. So here we go. Have you ever played high and low? He held a single card to his head with that, come on, you gotta try this look that my lady and I had become familiar with. Familiar, rooted in the word family. Family is where home is, and our new neighbor was a homemaker, a hands-on craftsman who built our shared background, and the barbecue burgers and fried eggs kind of friendly, and the burgers were fire. His post-pandemic superpower was turning a pantry into provisions. The village ate, and ate well. This man could season well above his melanin concentration, so we trusted him. Since moving in, we'd been introed to plenty games across color lines, some where the rules were too suburban for this Brooklyn blood, but this one seems simple. Okay, what are the rules? We each take a card and hold it to our heads, and we have to guess who has the high card or the low card. The one who guesses right wins. All right, simple enough. A few rounds and it's a game of Russian roulette with your assumptions. See a king on his head, assume they have the high card, wrong, you had the ace. See a 5, definitely the low card, wrong, you have a 3. The rounds are quick, like snap judgments. We played this one time. The card stuck to my head, stuck in my mind. A popular acting coach wanted reality from his students, wasn't getting any. Then an idea freight trained to an upturned finger. Aha, try this. Everyone play a little higher or a little lower than your counterpart. Voila. All of a sudden, real life breaks loose. A tiny game of power that lurks behind every set of eyes. A game of high and low. We're going to watch this video. It's called The Brown-Eyed, Blue-Eyed Experiment. There are enough pamphlets about to guess where anyone could think where this is going. A workshop amongst law enforcement, in a video I had never seen nor heard of before this. And so this should be interesting. A teacher in the middle of too far from where I grew up had a quandary. Her group of young students could not fathom the civil rights movement. Their lives were as far from it as their skin was from the fire. But she had a plan. She said, today, all the blue-eyed kids come to the front. You are better, and because you're better, come to the front. Brown-eyed kids to the back. Everything went south for the winter. IQ and EQ fell through the floor. The brown-eyed kids, dejected and hopeless, immediately became subject to the perception of being below, and they sunk to that level and further down still. The next day, everything in reverse. Blue-eyed kids, back of the bus. Brown-eyed kids, you're better. You come up front. And just like that, a new card, a new leaf. Brown-eyed kids soared to the heights of hallelujah, while the blue-eyed kids behind them, who were just on the mountaintop yesterday, sank to the bowels of Hades. The mere suggestion of superiority was enough to turn the tide and the table. So have you played high and low? When I told my neighbor no, it turned out I'd lied to his face. Was invited to do DEI work for a major city. And we got to the part about hierarchy and how we treat people, and it hit me. The card fell from my head, landed on my desk, and the download shot through the Zoom link. I told him about my neighbor, about a game of cards that he taught me. and how it reminded me of an acting coach who wanted people to live in the real world and the reality of the power to implant belief that you are less. And that's enough to get into someone's mind and take children from the honor roll to being rolled over. I told them that DEI isn't about taking the high card from anybody. It is about refusing to walk through the world like the low card is the only card you got or the only one you get. That cards dealt in skin, creed, private life, or beliefs do not subject you to assuming that those cards aren't in a winning hand. We are always playing high and low. And you know what? There's a fair chance that sometimes your cards are even. And you know what? If you do have the low card, it happens sometimes. You can still make the cut, but you know what? There's the fair chance that your card is better. And there is nothing stopping you from believing that but belief itself. Every day is a game of high and low. Here are the rules. Name your card. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Marshall. You got me messed up. I'm just wanting to grab some tea and sit down and talk about everything that you just said, but we can't. We so appreciate you coming on. That was absolutely brilliant.